Welcome along to the Make It Count podcast. My name is David.
My name is Matt.
And we are the Taylor Bros.
Making it count.
Making it count, hopefully every week or every day or...
Maybe just for 15 minutes
every
week.
Single second. Is that how you do it? Every single second?
I make it count most when I'm asleep, I think.
Good. What are we talking about today, Matt?
Ooh.
Last week we were talking about Luddites. Today...
Yes, just as I take a big swig of drink.
Yeah.
We're talking about a quote by Steve Jobs.
Yeah, the famous Steve Jobs of Apple, and he also did Pixar storytelling for a bit, didn't he?
He might have. I think he teamed up with them.
Yeah. What was the quote you wanted to talk about?
The most powerful person in the world is the storyteller.
Yeah, and so he followed that up with this idea that because you're the storyteller, you set the vision, the values, and even the agenda of an entire generation.
And it depends, I suppose, how big you're telling those stories and what format you're telling those stories in. So it could be just in any context. You are the one setting the agenda, setting the tone, setting the arena.
So storytelling, what do you think about storytelling?
I think it's a great idea. Yeah, great.
Great idea.
We've been doing it for ages.
Yeah.
Humans. I think, in a sense, we are story creatures.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's been lots of attempts at defining what makes humans different. I suppose one of the defining things would be, we tell stories. In a sense, you think, does it have any real function in terms of survivability, which obviously some people think is the sole purpose of our race, is to just survive and keep going. Storytelling doesn't seem to. Obviously, you might.
I dispute that.
I was about to caveat that.
Okay, go caveat.
Obviously, you can tell stories that are warning or learning or sharing experience from others, but there are some stories that you tell that seem just for the joy of it, for the delight of it, and that doesn't necessarily carry any usefulness in and of itself.
Mm-hmm. Well, but also, I think you think of a tribe or a community, they tell a story, and it's their story, and it reminds them who they are in their group.
Yeah.
And I think, that community, that tribal element that brings them together, you could definitely say that's sort of survivability.
Identity forming.
Yeah.
Formation.
One of the things I was thinking about, and I've become quite interested in storytelling over the last few years, read some books around it, and this idea that every culture throughout history has told stories. But now we're in an era where we've professionalized storytelling, like so many other things, right? So
yes.
In music, people used to do music. It didn't matter how good, you would sing together, you would do that. Now, what do? You watch the professional do a music at a live show.
Yeah.
And actually storytelling is a similar thing where everybody used to tell their stories in their families, in their communities. Whereas now what do? We let the TV shows tell the stories. We let the big budget ones, the films, and cinema, and they're the ones that are telling the story. And if we agree with Steve Jobs and say the most powerful person is the storyteller, and it's about we let a few professionals in the world decide what stories they're telling and how they're telling them, I think that's quite an interesting idea.
Absolutely. I mean, something that's popped into my mind is obviously another domain where we are constantly hearing, consuming stories is the news.
Mm-hmm.
And there are some things, I think you told me, there are some very large newspapers in the UK that run on a huge loss every year. And you think, well, how is that possible? How is it feasible that a business stays in business year after year running at tens of millions, maybe even more of loss every year? Mm-hmm. Well, of course, where's the money coming from? Okay, what are they telling the story of? And there was, of course, the famous Brexit vote in 2016, I believe, in the UK. And I find Liverpool a fascinating case study as a city because 30 years previously, a huge event had happened, Hillsborough disaster, and one of the newspapers had given effectively a defamatory newspaper headline on their front page, and it was ultimately turned out to be complete lies and utter slander. And so that newspaper was boycotted in Liverpool for basically 25, 30 years now. And they voted so differently from the surrounding area and the towns and cities that have similar demographics than all the rest, based on almost, it seems like this one newspapers' influence,
Mm-hmm.
the lack of it in that city,
Mm.
led to such a drastic change in the perception and the stories that people were consuming.
Mm.
And I think that, and I'm sure there's more complexity to that. I'm sure, don't email me. But I think that shows the power of storytelling, built over decades.
Mm-hmm.
The effect of the stories we consume every week, every day, make a difference. And we're not even aware that that's happening.
So Steve Jobs of Apple, he's done a couple of quite iconic adverts. One they ran in the Super Bowl. It was a sort of a 1984 one. You had this woman running along and she sort of destroys this screen and it's like break the mold, that's Apple. And everyone, it's sort of iconic really at the moment when Apple was not big. They were sort of on the edge, but it resonated with people and it put them on the map. And then there was another advert I remember, and I sort of looked up it, and we could even put that in the show notes.
Yep.
This idea of think differently.
Yeah.
Here's to the crazies, the misfits, the
Square pegs in round holes.
Yeah, all of this. And so you can do all sorts. You can vilify them, you can praise them, you can quote them, but you can't ignore them. And here's to the ones that think they're going to change the world, because they normally do. You call them crazy, we call them genius, sort of thing. And then just comes up, think differently. And it's this iconic, they're telling a story there. They're telling a story about you, and they're inviting you into that story. And what's quite funny to me about it, and I think I've heard other people say that, is most people think they're that person. Yeah, most people resonate with the title of Misfit.
Yeah.
And so it's this really somehow broad appeal that feels really narrow to the person watching it, which is a really powerful story. And it's probably a big part of what shaped Apple and shaped their popular appeal over the last 10 to 20 years.
Yeah. So I suppose off the back of that, it's intriguing. Yeah, I like that. Everybody thinks they're the misfit. I think that maybe fits into some of our just angst as humans. Does anyone really get me? And that's where, I suppose, in an increasingly connected digitally but disconnected in real life, where we don't take the time in community to empathize with people, to truly listen, maybe we are increasingly not understood and not understanding others. So that message fits ever more. I suppose we're going back to the original quote, the most powerful person is the storyteller. What does that mean for us in terms of how we engage in story, the stories we're consuming, and maybe even the stories we're telling?
Brilliant, because I was about to go there as well. Just this idea that there are lots of stories in the world around us. And I think it was Dan Potter that said, if you don't know your story, someone will tell you your story for you.
Wow.
And there's lots of people out there who are happy to sell you their story that you live into. The story of you're not enough, so buy my product, or you feel this, so buy this from me.
Yeah.
And so being aware of those stories when they're happening around us, but also telling your own story. And if we say the most powerful person is the storyteller, we all have stories about ourselves that we believe. Maybe we do believe that I'm not enough story.
Yeah.
Well, that's quite a powerful story to believe about yourself. Can you tell a new story with a new frame, with a new perspective that is more overcoming, more courageous, more true of who you are as a person? And I think that's just really important to think that there are people around you that want to tell you stories that will exploit you. But there are hopefully people in your life, in your community, that will tell you stories that are true of you, that call out a greater maturity, a responsibility, these higher values that we look for, and that you can choose to believe them instead.
Absolutely. This reminds me of the keystone habit we talked about 2 summers ago, or a summer ago, eating meals together around the table. And the power of that for kids in families or households where that happens goes far beyond the context of the table, partly because what they reckon happens there is in the context of safe space with people that you know and love and that know and love you. You are being given that identity, part of that family identity, and those voices, which are safe and loving, hopefully, are louder than and have more credibility than the outside voices, because it's more easy to say, well, yeah, these people know me and they're speaking life into me, and those outside voices, they don't know me, and so clearly it almost becomes more like water off a duck's back. Whereas in the absence of positive storytelling, positive identity formation, in that vacuum rushes everything else, and we are so much more quick to believe it. And I think that's part of, again, don't want to be doomsdaying here, but it's not surprising necessarily that in the rise of things like social media and in the rise of an internet which is now suffused with, the way that we fund an internet is, instead of people paying for an amazing service up front for access to the internet and communication, it's free to access except for you're being sold something on every street corner, digital street corner. So it's all funded by advertising. It's not surprising that in that world we're seeing ever increasing rates of people being anxious and depression rates and feeling lonely and isolation. And of course, people that are lonely and isolated and anxious are far more ready to accept the story that is told to them of, oh, well, to help you not feel that, we'll sell you this. Whether that be clothes, tech, drugs, drink, anything, we will alleviate your suffering and give you the life you've always dreamed of. That carries far more weight when there is a story vacuum.
And so to go back to the quote and maybe to wrap this up is, there are a myriad, so many stories out there that we can choose to believe. And the ones that have power are the ones we do believe.
Yes.
So think about, what are the stories you're subscribing to ultimately? Maybe it is literally subscribing to, or maybe it's just inside your brain, that like the ones you've gone along and you've aligned with.
Yes.
And test them. Is that a story that makes you more human or less human?
Yeah.
Is that something that brings out higher values of love and courage, or lower values of need and absence? And
I suppose, how do we spot some of those stories? Perhaps moments of high emotion. So picture when you've made a mistake, or you forgot something, or you dropped something, or you made a mistake. What are the first words out of your mouth that speak about yourself to the world? Are they, you stupid person, or you always do? If that's the case, then that is a little bit of a clue that we've got this underlying belief system of ultimately you're incapable, or you're stupid, or whatever it is. And that can give us a help to go, maybe I'm going to rewrite that story. So go rewrite some stories, guys. Go make it count. Tell stories that are great about people, to bring life and love and joy into the world that you are in.